We are in 2 Samuel chapter 20. So we're continuing a journey through this book, and we find ourselves here where after Absalom has died through his rebellion, David comes back to Jerusalem. And then as he comes back, there is this dispute between the tribes because of an event that took place. And then there's here in chapter 20 a rebel by the name of Sheba. He's a Benjamite, and he begins to now try to again bring the tribes away from David. So let's look through this chapter. Let's see what God has in store for us. Father, we're so grateful for just you and your grace, how you constantly bring us to an understanding of what unity is, and how there are always those people that want to bring dissension, want to bring division. And yet, Lord, there's a plan and a purpose that you have, and Lord, just through this teach us what it is to be knit to you. Teach us what it is to have a desire for unity, to know that although Israel is made up of 12 individual tribes, it's one nation, and you're their God, and you want to bring them to a place, and yet they constantly allow their own desires, their own pride to get in the way, and the desire for the individual versus the need of the nation. But here tonight, simply instruct us, teach us your heart, your will. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So here in chapter 20, it begins very simply, and there happened to be a rebel whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite, and he blew a trumpet and said, "We have no share in David, nor do we have an inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel." So every man of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah from the Jordan as far as Jerusalem remained loyal to their king. It's interesting. We know what happens. Some people follow, some people do not. There's this incredible lack of unity. There's this rebellion that's going on. And I want you to understand that it has developed even more than what we think here has gone on. If you remember that when we were back in chapter 19, and what happened was this, that when we were back in chapter 19, what happened was the Lord had wanted David to, David was going to come back home. And as he was coming back home, what we saw was this, that there was a time where in verse 9, what we saw was this, that the king arose, or all the people were in dispute throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king saved us from the hand of our enemies. He delivered us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he has fled from the land because of Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, has died in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing back your king?" So the people of Israel have desired that all of a sudden we want to see here David come back. The issue being is that as they want, the nation of Israel wants David to come back, eventually there's this reproof that comes with the tribe of Judah, because they're the ones who are in the greatest delay. Now, keep in mind that a lot of Judah has already followed Absalom. And so now they're delaying in bringing David back. And so we see in chapter 19, in verse 11, so King David said to Zadok and Abiathar the priest, speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are you the last to bring the king back to his house, since the word of all Israel have come to the king to his very house? And you are my brethren. You are my bone and my flesh. Why then are you the last to bring back the king? To understand that when David was coming back after the death of Absalom, that the first group of Israel was the northern tribes, the northern tribes. And so eventually the last one to come on board was Judah. And this is a unique thing, because initially when we started the book of 1 Samuel, if you remember what happened in the very first chapter, that as David began to, as we learned that Saul had died, David is there in Judah, And eventually what happens is this, that in chapter 1, verse 4, we make a note of this. It says this, then chapter 2, verse 4. So we're in chapter 2. It says this, the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead, they were the ones who buried Saul. So we understand that when Saul died, Judah was the first, because Israel has no king. Judah was the first to say, yes, David, we understand that you should have been the king, that you were always the king, you were anointed the king, and so why don't you come and be our king? And so Judah was the first when David came, and eventually we saw that there in the second chapter of 2 Samuel, but Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, brought him over to Mahanaim, and there he made him, who makes Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, over all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. So we understand that he's over all of Israel. Judah has only David. And eventually, as Ishbosheth gets murdered, then all of Israel comes and says, yeah, David, why don't you be our king? And we recognize you've always been good to us, so come and do that. But what happens is this, when David comes back, Israel is the first to step out. Israel is the first to say, yeah, we want you to come back. And Judah is the one who's behind the 8 ball. Now, as we go a little bit further in chapter 19, what we see is this. In verse 40, it says this, now the king went on to Gilgal. So he's coming back from the wilderness wanderings. He's coming back to Jerusalem. He's about to cross over the Jordan. The king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham and went on with him, and all the people of Judah escorted the king, and also half the people of Israel. So we see that as the word came back that David is coming back to Jerusalem, Israel is trying to come back, but only half the people. So the ones from the further distance, they're not there yet. They're going to be, but they're not there yet. And so the ones who are closest are there. Judah finally comes. Judah's there. And so it makes a statement that Judah's there. Half of the people of Israel are there. And then verse 41, as they're ushering the king back, they said, just then all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, why have our brethren, the men of Judah, stole you away and brought the king, his household, and all David's men with him across the Jordan? So they're frustrated because everything's taking place and they haven't been there yet. It's something like Judah is stealing the show. They're like, hey, we're the ones who are his brethren. We're the ones who are doing this, even though they were the last to say, David, yes, come home. They're the first ones, and they don't wait for the rest of Israel to come. Well, the rest of Israel sees this as a diss, and so all the men of Judah, they now answer the rest of Israel. And they say this in verse 42, all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is a close relative of ours. In other words, he's of Judah, we're of Judah, he's a close relative, and that's why we get to do what we get to do. And so, why then are you angry over this matter? Have we ever eaten at the king's expense, or has he given any of us a gift? So they said, listen, we don't benefit from it, but we are his true relatives. We are his kinsmen. We are of the same tribe. Now keep in mind that David is of Judah, but he's also what? He's the king of Israel. He's the king of the entire nation. And so, verse 43, the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, we have 10 shares in the king. Therefore, we also have more right to David than you, because he's not just the person of Judah, he's the king of Israel, and we have these 10 shares. Were we not the first to advise bringing back our king? Yet the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. So this is the event that's taking place. All of a sudden, we see that through Israel and through Judah, now their words become fiercer, and then eventually what happens is Judah's a little bit louder, and Judah's a little bit more boisterous, and so the Judah's words were more fierce. In other words, they were the passions are inflamed. And then because of that, because of this event that took place, because of this scene that now is there as David's coming back, Judah is first. Of course, half of Israel is there, but the rest of Israel, when they come back, don't recognize, hey, half us there. We're just kind of late on the ball. They felt, wronged because they thought you should have waited for all of us and we should have all had a part of this. And I agree with what that is because David is a king over entire nation. And so if there was words, send out runners, hey, we're on our way, do something, don't just not show up. Well, as David comes, Judah, half of Israel is welcoming them across. And then all of a sudden we see here that the rest of Israel is upset. And then through that row that's going on, through the dissension that's going on, this is what takes place in chapter 20. It says, and there happened to be there a rebel whose name was Sheba, a son of Bichri, a Benjamite, and he blew a trumpet. So this man, his name is Sheba. It makes a note that he is a rebel. The term in the Hebrew is Belial. He's, basically he's an evil, a worthless man, a wicked man. And so he's also a Benjamite. So he's one in the same as Shimei. He's of the tribe of Saul. He's of the tribe of the last king. And so he basically saying, I don't know why we should have someone from Judah versus someone from Benjamin being the king. We had Saul, we had his son. Why is it now that Judah thinks they can reign? And all of a sudden you have this man of Judah and he's not with all of us. He seems to be only for Judah. And so this man Sheba, he blows his trumpet, catches the attention. And remember the words that were spoken of there in chapter 19, where they said in verse 43, the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, we have 10 shares in the king. Therefore, we also have more right to David than you. We have 10 tribes, you have one. So basically, we have, 10 shares, you have one share. And so we have, just as much right for each individual tribe. You add us all up, and we have even more right than you to be here. Well, the man Sheba made this statement at the end of verse 1. We have no share in David. In other words, you're not our king. We don't even want you. So you're not even a part of us anymore. We have no share in you, nor do we have an inheritance in the son of Jesse. We're not anticipating you ruling us. We don't want anything from you. So every man to his tents, O Israel. And so every man of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba. And so this is what begins to happen. We see here that there's this division that takes place through the nation of Israel. Now, this division that takes place in the nation of Israel is not an uncommon thing. It's not an uncommon theme that goes on, because what happens is this so often, and we make a note of this, that Israel is one nation. And as one nation, it has, it had Moses ruling over them, but through the nation, they had individual tribes. When Joshua came on the scene, they told Joshua, as we followed Moses, so we'll follow you. Now, what Joshua did was this. He came to the land, and what they did is they divided up the land into areas for each tribe. So each tribe would have an inheritance. And what was important is that family tribe, that family inheritance was a very thick, a very motivating thing. And so each tribe had their own area. But although each tribe had their own area, keep in mind they were one nation. They were Israel as a whole. And it's very similar to the United States. We are one nation, supposedly under God. We have individual states. Individual states have rights, yet the federal has, another thing. And so what they want is, hey, listen, if the federal wants something for the benefit of the nation, all the states need to acquiesce to the benefit of the federal. And so each state has a representative that you can have through the Senate and through the House. And so they will make laws, and the laws that come federally, then the states are bound to those laws as well. The same thing happens with Israel. You have one nation, but you have individual tribes. And these tribes, every so often, you're going to see divisions within that. You remember all the way back in the book of Numbers in chapter 32, something kind of crazy went on because what happened was this: the children of Reuben in the very first verse of Numbers 32, and the children of Gad in a very great multitude had a very great multitude of livestock. And when they saw the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, and indeed the region was a place for livestock. And the children of Gad and the children of Reuben came and spoke to Moses, to Eleazar the priest, and to the elders of the congregation, saying, basically, verse 5, if they said, if we have found favor in your sight, let this land be given to your servants as a possession. Do not take us over the Jordan. And so what they wanted is these three tribes. You have, Judah, you have Gad, and you have the half tribe of Manasseh. They wanted to stay on the eastern side of the Jordan. Well, eventually Moses says, hey, listen, you guys can't do that because we need to go in and we need to fight for the land. You need to be part of that fighting with us as we have are trying to gain our inheritance, which the Lord gave us. And eventually what happens is this. In verse 17, Judah and Gad make this statement. They said, listen, Numbers 32, verse 17, but we ourselves will be armed and ready to go before the children of Israel until we have brought them to their place. And our little ones will be in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until every one of the children of Israel has received his inheritance. And so they make this promise, they make this step to say, hey, listen, we're going to stick with you. Nothing's going to happen. We're going to make sure you have your promise. You guys divide your land, but we're not going to cross over. And eventually we see it was fulfilled. Joshua 22, the first 4 verses. Then Joshua called the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half tribe of Manasseh, and he said, you have kept all that Moses, the servant of your Lord, commanded you. You have obeyed my voice and all that I have commanded you. And you've not left your brethren these many days up to this day, but have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brethren, and he has promised them. Now therefore return, go to your tents into the land of your possession, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. To understand that it's going to happen that some follow, some don't. It's a normal thing that you're going to have times where people are just, there are going to be those who follow, there are going to be those who don't follow. If you remember in the book of Ruth, eventually what took place was this. In the very first chapter, in the 7th verse, after Naomi's husband dies, after Oprah and Ruth, Naomi's sons die, eventually it takes place where therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. So Naomi wants to leave. And as she begins to leave Moab, then what happens is this. They went on their way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go return each one to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. So as you've been kind to my sons, kind to me, go back to your parents' house, stay here in Moab, and let your parents take care of you. Well, the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and they wept. And then they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, now here they both said, we want to come, we want to be a part of you. Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughter, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Oprah kissed her mother. So Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods, and return after your sister-in-law. So we see here very clearly that Orpah leaves. And then Naomi tells Ruth, you need to go too. But Ruth in verse 16 and 17 said, entreat me not to leave you, nor to turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me more and more also, if anything but death departs you and me. And when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. So she stopped telling her to go home. But I think it's so important to recognize that there are people who will stick with you. There are people who will not stick with you. Even Paul, he had this incredible experience where he told Timothy in Second Timothy chapter 4, beginning in verse 16, he says this, at my first defense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them. So no one stood with me. Everyone left me. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, that the message might be preached fully through me, that all the Gentiles might hear that I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. And so understand that it does happen where you have people who follow you and then they don't. Even the Lord, I mean, he was not immune to this. Remember in Mark chapter 14, verse 50, that all the disciples fled. They all left him. And so we recognize that they all forsook him and they fled. Jesus is being arrested. They all left. And so keep in mind that we're noting here, although Israel is one nation, it's made up of 12 individual tribes. Each tribe has their own territories. The individual tribes would sometimes think of their own personal benefits, what works for me, over what is the need of the land. And this is what's happening now, because leaders like Sheba are going to bring others to their side. They're going to use these slogans. They're going to use these points of view, and they're going to use this perceived disrespect, this dissing that took place. And so here you have Sheba leading these tribes away from David. And so he's leading these tribes away from the unity. Now, at this point, he doesn't claim that he's going to be the king, but he's saying, we can't have David as king. We need to leave him. And so they're now to that point where as they leave, verse 2, so every man of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah from the Jordan as far as Jerusalem remained loyal to their king. So we see here that as Sheba and the rest of the tribes leave, eventually Judah sticks with the king, brings the king all the way back to his house. Verse 3 is kind of a sad verse within this chapter, because in verse 3 we see this. Now David came to his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 women, his concubines, whom he had left to keep the house, and he put them in seclusion and supported them, but did not go into them. So they were shut up to the day of their death, living in widowhood. So understand what has happened. That David had these 12 or these 10 concubines. And the beginning of this event comes all the way back into chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. In verses 11 through 12, it makes this declaration. As Nathan is speaking, he says, thus says the Lord, behold, I will rise up an adversary against you from your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. So David receives this prophecy of what is going to happen between because of his adultery, that his act that he did. Now he tried to do it in private, and God says, listen, you're going to experience the same pain of someone else going into your wives. And this is going to be done publicly. It's not going to be done in secret. What happened was this. In chapter 16, we made a note that in verses 20, that what happened was that David himself is going to be, let me back that up because I have another verse that I want to look at. In chapter 12 is the prophecy. And then in chapter 15, that's the one that I'm looking at now, verse 16, it made this statement. Then the king went out with all his household after him, but the king left 10 women, concubines, to keep the house. So when David leaves with all of the rest of his wives and his children, all the men, he leaves Jerusalem. He, for whatever reason, leaves 10 concubines, lesser wives, there to keep the house and to tend the house. Well, now all of a sudden we see in chapter 16, beginning in verse 20, that Absalom says to Ahithophel, give advice as to what we should do. And Ahithophel said to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you are abhorred by your father. Then the hands of all who are with you will be strong. So, what Ahithophel does, who's the grandfather of Bathsheba, he gives Absalom this amazing counsel. He says, I want you to do to your father what your father did to my granddaughter. I want you to go in and shame him. And so he tells Absalom, I want you to go in and lie with the concubines that your father has left. And so he does this. He goes in and he defiles the concubines. Well, all of a sudden, we begin to see that now what David does is he now comes. In verse 3, David came to his house at Jerusalem. The king took the 10 women, his concubines, whom he'd left to keep the house. He put them in seclusion and he supported them. So he puts them in their own place. He takes care of their needs. So they have food, they have warm, they have, companionship with each other. But basically, they had no other relations with no other men for the rest of their lives. And so, because they were David's wives, but because Absalom, his son, had defiled them, David just puts them aside. And it's just such a sad thing that goes on like that. And so we begin to see that it's just incredible that what happens is there's just this disconnect with what's going on. And so we see here this incredible wrong that's been done to the women. And so even David himself doesn't go to comfort you. He just puts them aside and say, you guys are basically widow, now. And so just a sad portion. And keep in mind that this is not a unique one-off that comes to that. Remember all the way back in chapter 13 of 2 Samuel, there was David's daughter Tamar. Well, his oldest son, Amnon, lusted after his sister. And so the sister was Absalom's sister. They were full brother and full sister, Absalom and Tamar. Amnon was her half brother. And eventually he was lusting after her. And so he had a friend, and his friend said, hey, listen, I know what you need to do. I have this great idea. And so Jonadab tries to deceive everyone by having Amnon deceive them by saying, hey, I'm sick. I need my sister to come and bake me some cakes. Well, eventually he wants to lie with her. And she comes and says, listen, this isn't a good thing. We can't do that. This is wrong. So in verse 11, when she, this is Tamar, had brought them, these cakes that he wanted to eat to him, this is Amnon, to eat. He took hold of her and said, come lie with me, my sister. But she answered, says, no, my brother, do not force me. No such thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. And where would I take my shame? As for you, you'd be like one of the fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. However, he would not heed her voice, and he being stronger than she, he forced her and he lay with her. Immediately after he fulfills his lust, verse 15, then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, rise and be gone. So now I want nothing to do with you. Get out of my house. Get out of my life. Get out of my sight. The same thing in the sense that we see is happening to these 10 concubines of David. They are living separately. They no longer have companionship. They have been defiled. It wasn't their choice. It wasn't their sin. It was done to them. This wrong was done to them. And so he just says, arise and be gone. And so verse 16, she says, so no, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other that you did to me. But he would not listen to her. He says, listen, you're shaming me even more. First you lie with me, and then you basically make me lie in waste. I'm going to waste away now. You've ruined all my chances for having a husband, my chances for having a children, because now I'm defiled, and so I won't be any good to anyone. And so he called his servant, verse 17, after he would not listen to her, who attended to him, and said, "Here, put this woman out away from me." And he bolted the door behind her. Now she had on a robe of many colors, for the king's virgin daughters wore such apparel. And the servant put her out and bolted the door behind her. Then Tamar, verse 19, put ashes on her head, tore her robe of many colors that was on her, and laid her hand over her head, and went away crying bitterly. And Absalom, her brother, said to her, "Has Amnon your brother been with you? But now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart." Then it says this at the end of verse 20, which is just so reminding me of just what's happening to these 10 concubines. It says this at the end of verse 20. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. So there was no healing, there was no helping, there was nothing. And so the same thing that we see here was happening to these 10 concubines, and just absolutely incredible how devastating that God doesn't candy coat the wrongs that are done to people. He doesn't candy coat the wrong mentalities that are there in society. And so this is what happens. David takes care of them. It wasn't their sin, but they are basically destitute, so and desolate. And so verse 3, they were shut up till the day of their death, living in widowhood. So they were now put aside, all because of someone else's sin. And keep in mind that David had chosen to leave them there even after the prophecy that Nathan had spoken. He chooses to do this. And so although David taking responsibility, I'm going to take it and I'm going to feed you, make sure that you have a place to stay, I will not have any kind of relationship with you. Now you guys are defiled, and so because of that sin, I'm going to put you away. Well, verse 4 says this: the king said to Amasa, "Assemble the men of Judah for me within 3 days, and be present here yourself." So remember what happened with Amasa, that eventually in chapter 17, verse 25, it made this declaration that Absalom made Amasa captain of the army instead of Joab. And so we recognize it as, Absalom comes and takes over the kingdom. He does not make Joab the commander of the army. He takes his cousin, Amasa, and he makes him the new general. And keep in mind, we already know who Amasa is. There's this genealogy in First Chronicles chapter 2, and it makes a statement that basically, after it talk about their sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail, the sons of Zeruiah were Abishai, Joab, and Asahel, the three, and Abigail bore Amasa. So out of David's sisters, we understand that one has Joab and his brothers, the other has Amasa. So they're cousins is what they are. So Absalom puts his cousin as the general of the army, and now Amasa is the one who's going to pursue David, and he's now the general of the army that is trying to kill David. So think about what's happening. As he does this, he fails in his task as the general. But very uniquely, what David does is this: David comes on the scene and he makes this declaration that eventually, when he comes back, he tries to talk to the nation, and he makes this statement in chapter 19 of 2 Samuel, verse 13. "Say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? Are you not my nephew? God, do so to me and more also, if you are not commander of the army before me continually in the place of Joab." So what David has done is this: he's made his nephew Joab, he's kind of demoted him, and then he raised up the other one, Amasa, his other nephew, that was in league with his son Absalom. So in the sense that now all of Absalom's followers that were there pursuing against David are going to say, yeah, Amasa is our military leader. We can follow him. So David, in a sense, is going to bring this army back. And so he tells Amasa, I think, okay, you need to go and you need to assemble the men of Judah, and you have 3 days to do this, to be here to present yourself. So you've got 3 days to gather up the army. Now, keep in mind that the part of the army that he's getting was his already. These are the ones who's now fled, and it's like, okay, wait a second, you've already gathered us up. We went against David. Who are you gathering up for now? So regardless of what happened, he delays. Verse 5 said, so Amasa went to assemble the men of Judah, but he delayed longer than the set time which David had appointed to them. So David appointed him 3 days. It takes longer than he does. And so rather than taking the men that he can and then be obedient to the timeline, he extends the timeline. Well, because he extends the timeline, David now says to Abishai, and of course we understand that he is Joab's brother. He says to Abishai, now Sheba and the son of Bichri will do us more harm than Absalom. Take your Lord's servants and pursue him, lest he find for himself a fortified cities and escapes us. So because of the delay of Amasa, David now brings his other nephew, the brother of Joab, and he says to Abishai, listen, I want you to go assemble as many people you can. You need to pursue this guy. You need to get after him now. We can't delay. And so as Amasa is delaying, David now puts basically Abishai in place to say, you need to take what's happening. Now it says this in verse 7, and I think it's just so profound how the scripture is so honest. As he calls Abishai, it says, I want you to go at him. It says in verse 7, so Joab's men. Abishai may be the commander, but Joab is the one that all the men look to. Joab is the one that all the men respect. And so what's happening is this. Joab is the one who's going to be leading the men. Absalom is the one who is the de facto in charge, but Joab is the one who does all the actions of the one who's in charge. And so Joab's men with the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and we've talked about them before. These were David's bodyguards. Those are the ones who are mentioned in chapter 8. In verse 18, and so we understand those were the ones who guarded his life. And so Joab with the Cherethites and the Pelethites and all the mighty men. So you have the 600 men and his mighty men, all the people who were at one point in debt, in distress, and discontented are now David's army. And so they went out after him, and they went out of Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. So you have this powerful group, not an entire army yet, but you've got this group of warriors, small army, yes. And so now they begin to pursue Sheba. It says this in verse 8, when they were there at the large stone, which is in Gibeon, Amasa came before them. Now Joab was dressed in battle armor, and on it was a belt with a sword fastened in its sheath at his hips, and as he was going forward, it fell out. So keep in mind that there is this understanding that now Amasa comes and he is the general now. He is the one who's in charge of the troops. So because he was delayed, he now comes, he finds Joab, Abishai, he sees these men, but he steps up saying, listen, guys, I know you're heading there. I'm the leader, let me lead you. So Joab, what he does is he's dressed in battle armor. And it says, and on there he had this belt and a sword. The language is interesting because it's one of two things. Either he actually does have a sword, which is there on his hip, or he has next to his sword, he has a dagger and a sheath in a sheath, not like a giant sword, but a dagger that he can slip out. And so you can kind of conceal a dagger. It's harder to conceal a sword. So one thing happens. Either he finds a way for a sword to fall out and he picks up the sword as he approaches Amasa, or he very cunningly slips the dagger out of its sheath. And so he's kind of hiding it. And so Amasa doesn't know what's going on. Well, it does declare that Joab was dressed in battle armor, and on his belt was a sword fastened in its sheath at his hips. And as he was going, it fell out. So if it was a dagger, he pulls it out of its sheath. And then Joab said to Amasa, "Are you in health, my brother?" So keep in mind that Joab is coming up to his cousin, and he's trying to greet him as his general. You understand this? Otherwise, like Joab is in this guise of greeting his new commander. And as he comes up, he's like, "Hey, you're my general. Are you in health, my brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa, verse 10, did not notice the sword that was in Joab's hand, and he struck him with it in the stomach, and his entrails poured out on the ground, and he died. He did not strike him again, thus he died. And Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued Sheba, the son of Bichri. So keep in mind that Joab has already killed Abner back in chapter 3. He's already killed Absalom back in chapter 18. And now he kills again Amasa. And so 3 people who were in leadership positions, Joab simply wipes them out. And so as David was going to raise up Abner, Joab takes out his competition. He kills David's son, even though David said, "I want the young man brought unharmed." And now, of course, he kills this next general who David replaced him with. And so any time that David brings someone to replace him, Joab makes sure that they're gone. And so I find it interesting that what happens is that Joab and Abishai, they begin to pursue. So they are all going. They're continuing on the road. The show is over. But meanwhile, verse 11, one of Joab's men stood near Amasa and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, follow Joab." So he's there and he's telling people, "Hey, don't worry about what you're seeing here. If you are for Joab, if you are for David, follow Joab. Everything is okay here. There's nothing to see, but yet here he is, a dead man with his entrails." So we saw in verse 12, it says, "Now Amasa wallowed in his blood in the middle of the highway, and when the man saw that all the people stood still, he moved Amasa from the highway to the field and threw a garment over him. And when he saw that everyone who came to him halted, and when he was removed from the highway, all the people went on after Joab to pursue Sheba and the son of Bichri." So we understand that when Joab kills Amasa, that he leaves him there in the middle of the road. He just walks on. He doesn't pay any attention. "I've got a job to do. I'm not going to slow down." But all the men who now come up are basically like when someone sees an accident on the freeway. Everyone stops to look. Everyone stops to gawk. Everyone stops to say, "What's going on here? Why is Amasa dead? Why is his entrails hanging out?" All these things. Eventually, the young man that was stationed there to tell the people, "Move on, move on, move on," he realized we're bottlenecking here. Everyone is looking to figure out what's going on. So he takes Amasa's body, he drags it off in the field, he covers it. Now all of a sudden, there's really nothing to see here. And so the men now begin to pursue Sheba with Joab. And so through that point, we see that it now comes to the area where in verse 14, "And he went through all the tribes of Israel to Abel and Beth Maacah, to all the Berites, and they were gathered together, and also went after Sheba." So he comes and he goes through all the tribes. He's trying to find Sheba, and eventually he finds him all the way up to Beth Maacah. Now, Beth Maacah is a fortified town that would be to the north and to the west of where the city of Dan is. And as you look to this, we begin to see that it's one of the northern cities. And so as they do this, we begin to see that here, as they gather together, they go after Sheba, and they came and they besieged him in Abel of Beth Maacah. And they cast up a siege mound against the city, and it stood by the rampart. And all the people who were with Joab battered the wall to throw it down. And a wise woman cried out to the city, "Hear, hear, please say to Joab, come nearby that I may speak with you." So we understand that as they come to the city, they begin to besiege the city. They understand that Sheba's in that city. There's a portion of scripture I want you to be aware of. Just jot it down somewhere in this passage so you have something to reference to. But in Deuteronomy 20, in verses 10 through 12, it says this: when you go near a city to fight against it, then proclaim an offer of peace to it. And it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under tribute to you and serve you. Now, if the city will not make peace with you, but it makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. So there is this understanding, this biblical principle that when you come to a city, try to make peace with it. Well, Joab doesn't do that. He simply comes and he begins to, verse 15, besiege the city. They cast up a siege mound, so they're making a pile of dirt and brush so they can put these siege engines up closer, and so it elevates the siege engine. So now you're taller than the walls. And so as they're doing this, now all of a sudden, this wise woman in verse 16, she comes in and she says, "Hey, please say to Joab, come nearby that I may speak with you." And so this wise woman comes and says, "Hey, I need to speak to Joab." Well, verse 17, when he'd come near her, the woman said, "Are you Joab?" And he answered, "I am." And she said to him, "Hear the words of your maidservant." And he answered and said, "I'm listening." So she spoke, saying, "They used to talk in former times, saying, they shall utterly seek guidance at Abel, and so they would end disputes. So there's this understanding that in this town that I am in, there's wise people. People would come here. You knew what they say. Hey, if you need guidance, come to Abel. If you want wisdom, talk to me. And so she said, "I am among," verse 19, "the peaceable and the faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city and a mother in Israel. Why would you swallow up the inheritance of your Lord? Why are you besieging us? We're innocent." And so Joab, verse 20, answered, said, far be it from me that I should swallow up and destroy. I don't want to destroy this city. It's not my intention to destroy the city." And then he says in verse 21, "That is not so. I'm not here to destroy this city." He says, "But a man from the mountains of Ephraim, Sheba, the son of Bichri by name, has raised his hand against the king, against David. Deliver him only, and I'll depart from your city." So the woman said to Joab, "Watch, and his head will be thrown to you over the wall." It's amazing on just how many times that the women have come and intervened on David's behalf to assist him into just what he needs to do as a man. Remember Abigail all the way back there in 1 Samuel 25 when David was enraged and he was about to do something that he would regret. Abigail came and talked sense to him. You had the woman of Tekoa, the wise woman that Joab said, "Hey, talk sense into David, kind of figure out a yarn to get David to bring, Absalom back." And so she does. You also have that in chapter 17, the woman's servant who in verses 17 through 20, she hides the sons of the priests so that, they're not found. So all these things, you see the women helping David, and this here wise woman too, she helps David. And so as she is seeking peace, basically as says, "Hey, try to talk peace." And so she comes to Joab, "Well, what do we need to do to make peace? Why are you making war with us?" So Joab said, it's all about this guy Sheba. And so eventually, verse 22, the woman in her wisdom went to all the people, and they cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and they threw it out to Joab. He blew a trumpet. They withdrew from the city, every man to his tent. So Joab returned to the king at Jerusalem. It's amazing that Joab doesn't even flinch. He just goes right back to the king as the leader of his army. because his other general is dead. And so as he kills Amasa, has no problem with that. He returns to the king. Verse 23, and Joab was over all the army of Israel. And Ananiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. Adoram was in charge of revenue, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was a recorder. Sheva, the scribe, Zadok and Abiathar, the priest, and Ira, the Jerethite, was the chief minister under David. And so it's absolutely incredible to see that all the things of who was in charge in David's kingdom. It is unique, and I want to point out one thing, that in chapter 8, verse 18, it talked about the same thing, where it talked about who were the people who reigned with David, because David brings up incredible men to reign. But the end of verse 18, it said this, and David's sons were chief ministers. You don't see his sons mentioned here anymore. He's taken his family out of the leadership roles. And so, but he does have other men in charge, just not his sons. And so just absolutely incredible to see how just once again God uses this woman to assist David. And I see this contrast of all these women that God used in such a credible way to bless this man. And yet we see that here he doesn't step up for his daughter Tamar. He doesn't step up for those 10 concubines. And so you see that this mixture of just a man that doesn't see the value. And so just through that, doesn't understand the pain. It doesn't understand what they're going through. And so it's just an interesting thing to ponder through, that David, although he's a man after God's own heart, he is not a perfect man. And there is this issue that the society had as women being lesser, and yet you see that they're completely wrong, because the women in just over and over again made David into the man. They assisted him in ways in which no other guy did. And so just absolutely incredible to see that within this rebellion, once again, it's a woman who steps up, and a woman that begins to assist, and a woman that is again unnamed, unmentioned, but is so powerful as far as being used by God. Father, we are just so grateful for this word in your heart. We are asking, Lord, that you, through your grace, you, through your spirit, will continue to meet and minister. Knit our hearts, draw our hearts to you through this. Continue to teach us what it is to have unity, even though we are individuals. Lord, we want to be a part of this body of Christ, and not just simply individuals wanting our own thing, but Jesus, what do you want? What is best for your body? And we want to be parts of that. So continue to knit our hearts to you with that. We